So I'm gonna give everyone a chance on the stream to say hello real quick. Daniel, Julius, Madison, and Devin, feel free to come off camera real quick. I just want to say hi. How's it going?
Hey, how's it going, Daniel? Good to meet you.
Happy Wednesday, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, this is Julius. I'm based in Dallas. Nice to see y'all.
Awesome. And one thing that I think everyone would love to hear is how did you get started in engineering and design? Like, what was the first thing that you built?
I can go first. I don't know if anybody remembers Neopets,
Oh my
which
God.
was, yeah.
Yes.
Big into like cursor tails and customizing my shop. So got into CSS at a young age and took it from there.
That's amazing.
I can go next. So let's see. I don't know if anyone remembers the streaming service called Rdio. It was like this really like designery like music streaming app back in the day. Rdio died. I was using Spotify and I like really missed their UI. So like the day before I went off to college, I reverse engineered the Spotify app to like build an Rdio theme and like make it really feel like the previous service. That was
Oh,
super
dope.
fun.
Nice. I'm gonna go ahead and popcorn to Julius.
Yeah, I first thing I built was probably like a school project, using like a idiot's guide to HTML and CSS thing. But the thing I probably wanted to do was actually just make websites about like fan sites about video games. So I used to make a lot of like forum signature banners for people. That's how I kind of got into design. I ran like a little like agency making free signature banners
Nice.
for people on smashboards.com if you knew that.
That's super cool. Daniel?
Yeah, my first thing was when I was a teenager, I worked for an architecture firm, and I somehow got tasked with rebuilding their website, even though I didn't really know what I was doing. So that was the first thing, and then after that, I was kind of hooked. You know, it was like back in the CSS Zen Garden days, kind of going there, getting some inspiration.
I will say y'all have way more legit beginnings than I did. Like I started off like making a website in Microsoft Front Page because I just found a CD in my uh well CD as well. I'm dating myself, but I found a CD in my brother's closet and ended up creating like this underground flash game website that we could use in school besides the besides the firewalls. And that was my start. 5 1/4 floppies. Wow. Great. So we're gonna go ahead and get started with Madison and Devin, and they're gonna talk about the process at Replit.
Cool. Yeah. So nice to meet everyone. My name's Devin. I'm a designer and engineer at Replit. I've been here about 2 years. I'm based in Manhattan.
And I'm Madison. I'm a full stack product engineer at Replit. I've also been here for about 2 years and I'm located outside of Boston.
Cool. So our little lightning talk here is called From Handoffs to Holding Hands. So this talk kind of revolves around some of like the softer aspects of like culture and process and workflows that we've found kind of make or break any good designer developer collaboration. And coming from the perspective that for us, a good collaboration looks a lot less like a kind of single handoff process, more like holding hands kind of continuously throughout our workflow. So just to kind of set the stage, like, as many of you probably know, shipping software can be a pretty messy process. You've got like a billion dependencies and you're managing a billion tabs and a billion messages and like a billion iterations. And it can be really full of these ups and downs and edge cases and tangents. There's a lot of milestones that can create stress. There's a lot of edge cases you can really struggle to predict. And of course, software development is very rarely linear. You can't always work completely in lockstep, but sometimes it feels like you're not always moving in the same direction at all. That's why we built this product, Replit for Teams. Replit is an online integrated coding platform. We've recently been working on a new product for teams to help them sort of work cross-functionally and work very fluidly. So what we're going to talk about today are some of the learnings we had around our process and our workflows, and even our team culture that help support building this product. Cool. Where do we start when we talk about collaboration? I'd like to start by talking about culture. I think a really good collaboration really starts and ends with your culture. So how do we start to foster a culture of collaboration? The first kind of tip here is basically at Replit, we consider our team to just be like one team. Like we think design and engineering are often these very siloed functions. For us, we're really just one team. We work in really close-knit small teams that own the process end to end. And another thing we found really useful is finding designers and engineers that really relate to each other and work well together and continuously pairing them up. I found that to be a really, really great way to work. I don't know, Madison, if you have anything else to say about this one.
Nope, I think you covered it. Design and engineering are functions, and teams are really people focusing on a goal together and building something.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think an important observation here is just that strong working relationships really contribute to strong work. So just focusing on building your relationships is really like the first part to starting a good collaboration. Now, alongside that, another thing we talk about a lot is just like this concept of psychological safety. So this boils down to basically like everyone on your team should feel comfortable admitting what they don't know, admitting when they're wrong, giving feedback, asking for feedback, voicing concerns, like just sharing their feelings in general. I feel like it can be really easy to kind of get lost in the weeds and everybody starts feeling stressed and fragmented and isolated. And that's just not a good environment conducive to putting out really good work. So a couple of things that we do internally at Replit are just like weekly shout outs. Like we just give these nice shout outs, recognizing each other's efforts or contributions, being willing to just call out when you're stressed, because it's likely that someone else on the team is too, and that can really diffuse a lot of tension. So thinking a lot about how promoting psychological safety can start to help your whole team feel a little bit more like at home while they're working. Anything to add, Madison?
Nope. I have thoughts on the next slide though.
Awesome. Go for it.
So when stress gets high, people are working on shipping something under a lot of pressure. The first thing that usually happens is that everybody wants to know what everybody else is working on and tries to track down that information. One thing that we found that works a lot better is doing push communication. So being super proactive about updating everybody about what's going well, where you are. We use the Linear Slack integration for this a lot. So we have a few channels where the weekly Linear updates for every project get posted. And then we also use the Linear integration for creating issues. So if Devin and I are in a thread talking about maybe part of a feature that's not really working the way that we thought it would work, we will create a Linear issue. And the great thing about the Linear plugin is that it actually updates back to Slack. So the whole thread gets captured in Linear, and then maybe when the Linear issue is completed, the Slack thread gets updated with the progress. So maybe you forgot about it because it was weeks ago. You get the update in Slack. It's great. So big fans of push communication at Replit. It makes a lot of things easier.
Awesome. Thanks, Madison. And just to be clear on the concept of push communication, this is opposed to this model of pull communication, which I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with. Pull communication is basically you're constantly asking people for information. Maybe you don't even know who to ask for the information you need. Maybe you're not even sure what information you need or who to ask to figure that out. So that can create a lot of stress. It creates a lot of meetings, confusion, like misaligned priorities in the worst case. In the pull model, like Madison said, everybody is proactively distributing information to the right people at the right time. And in this model, like ideally, nobody has to ask anybody else for information because it's just available. This means you have less meetings. It means you can potentially have less managers. And overall, just your process can be a little bit lighter. So the next tip as far as fostering a great collaboration goes would be to practice cross-functional reviews. So at Replit, we bring engineers into our design reviews. Basically, anytime we have a design review where somebody's presenting something an engineer might care about, we'll just tag them in Slack and invite them into the meeting. Likewise, we have a lot of designers that participate in code review, either actually like reviewing code, like, is this code good? Is it mergeable? Or just reviewing from a design perspective. So like if you're a designer and you want to get a little bit more involved in the technical discussions or learn a little bit more about your code base, but you just don't know how to code or don't know where to start, jumping into PR reviews and just asking your engineer to drop a screenshot of the changes and leaving some critique there can be a really great way to start engaging. Yeah, Madison, anything to add?
Yeah, so getting invited to design review as an engineer is super valuable, because usually I'm focused on shipping V0 of something, and Devin will be working on V1. And the main purpose of the meeting is for him to get feedback from other designers. I'm definitely there to offer like feedback and ask questions as well, but the most valuable part for me is actually listening to the discussion between designers about V5 or V10. Because it lets me inform some of my systems thinking and design. So if I know what's coming down the pipe, and if I'm building an API, I might be able to make some changes at the V0 stage that will make V5 easier. It's super valuable. Really enjoy being there.
Yeah. And as an example of how we went through this, I'll show this example a couple more times through this talk, but I designed this table component. It was pretty fancy and wanted to challenge myself to building it. And throughout this process, I had engineers participating in design review, kind of giving me pointers about where the implementation might become difficult and where I can start to simplify. When I started to actually build this out, I have this like, check this out. It's so long, this PR with like all kinds of feedback from designers and engineers and like all these different iterations. And like finally somewhere down here, it merged. But I honestly don't think this would have merged if I hadn't had these engineers like early in the discussion critiquing my work from their perspective. Now, the last tip in terms of collaboration is more of like the theme of this talk. Basically, like handoff is kind of a spectrum of fidelity. Rather than treating handoff as kind of a distinct phase or like this thing you have at the end of your design process, think about it as a constant requirement in your workflow, right? So we see handoff kind of as an anti-pattern, like done right, your design work is being continuously integrated and prototyped by engineering, and engineering is continuously exploring and prototyping their own ideas while design is maybe exploring a little bit further ahead. And this is just a really, really useful way to work. Like if you have handoff in your vocabulary at work, like just try to eliminate that word from your vocabulary and see how you can replace it and see what that leads to. Anything to add?
Yeah, so I think one of the most frustrating parts of the kind of waterfall approach. So waterfall is like design is complete, you hand it off to engineering, and engineering is kind of expected to ship what was designed in the first phase without a lot of communication. Sometimes like where you're actually at in that process is unclear. I have definitely built things before that were not, I would say, design ready. And that's a frustrating experience for design because obviously I built it, I kind of want to ship it anyway. And it's frustrating for engineering because obviously sometimes you may have to go back and redo things. So ready for dev mode has been super useful on that because you know that it's at least in a place where design thinks we should build it. And I guess the way that we work with Linear and Figma, we have tasks in Linear that are usually ready for engineering to pick up. They have a link to Figma. You go into the Figma file and maybe the link in Figma is actually not marked ready for dev. So it's super easy for me to reach out to Devin and be like, hey, Devin, do you actually want me to build this? Did you get feedback in crit that has maybe changed the direction that we're going to go in? So that is super useful. And also the opposite happens. Sometimes you might be looking at the Figma file and realize that something is marked ready for dev that isn't even captured in Linear. So it's super useful. We use it a lot.
Awesome. Cool. So those are just some tips on how to foster just like a good collaborative culture. And the summary there is basically like have a lot of conversations, like open and honest, be raw with your feelings and just kind of like put everything out there. Know that while design and engineering are maybe separate functions, they usually care about many of the same things and can work really in lockstep. So how do we put some of these things into practice? Like, what does this actually look like throughout our design process? Another thing we think a lot about beyond just designing our culture is actually designing our process. Like, what are our ways of working? How do we work best together? Especially knowing that we work in small teams or we like to work in pairs, it can really help to think about the tools we're using and the processes we're using. So one tip is to maintain living Figma files. So if handoff is this kind of continuous, like integrated process, you're not going to be able to just hand off a whole file and be like, okay, this is done, here you go. So the alternative that we practice is this kind of living Figma file. We have like one main Figma file for this team's product we call core patterns and components, and just everything is in there. We use Ready for Dev and this latest production section here you see on the sidebar to kind of just draw attention to things that are actually like ready to implement or close to what's in production. And we also have sections further down. We have like an archive section, we have an in progress section. And then another thing that we found helpful as far as living Figma files goes, anytime we present something in crit related to a project, we dump that into a separate file. So we have like a historical archive of everything we've ever reviewed with the whole team. We also use comments on those files and we don't resolve them. It can be useful just to drop back into a crit a few weeks ago and like see all of the comments still there. And then another thing we do is create team like playground files. So each individual on the team might have their own playground and they'll just kind of drop some of their own pet ideas here. And if there are larger pet ideas, like I have this pet idea called Team Cloud Computer that like it doesn't really have any bearing on the actual work we're doing, but I hope it will maybe a year from now. Anytime I have an idea there, I just drop it into this file. So what this means basically is like if you're capturing every idea you have, not really worrying about the fidelity or the scope or if it's tracked in Linear or not, these files become a really good living map of your product and can make it really easy for engineers to start to navigate your files. And last tip here, another thing we do to help make these files easy to navigate for engineers is I tend to organize my like latest in production screens under categories. So I have like patterns that are kind of global, views, which are like single screens, and then like flows, which are maybe a little bit more complex. And this has been a really helpful way to organize files for me. Anything to add, Madison?
Nope, that's it. Thanks, Devin.
Cool. Next tip, run a live jam session. This is like my absolute favorite way of working, especially if you have like a really strong designer engineer like pair kind of partnership. Basically, when in doubt, if you're feeling stuck on a problem or you just need more ideas or you're confused about how some technical system works from a design standpoint, like lock yourself in a room with like one engineer for like at least an hour, just as long as it takes. Come with an agenda and maybe a couple of artifacts to kind of think with, and just don't leave that room until you come out with an answer to whatever your question was or a solution to whatever your problem was. Yeah, and I've found this time and time again to be like the most useful and honestly most like enjoyable and fun way for me to work as well. Anything to add, Madison?
Yeah, it's awesome to, usually if you're like 10, 15, 20 messages deep on Slack, you'll save a lot of time by just hopping either in a huddle or Google Meet and doing it live in Figma.
Mm-hmm.
Devin,
so in this example,
oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
There are some questions in the chat about the way that we organize some stuff that I probably am not the best person to answer if you feel up to multitasking.
I don't know if I feel up to multitasking. Let me scroll back through those after we get to the next couple of slides. I appreciate the questions.
Sounds perfect.
So yeah, in this example, I was designing this like permissions interface for role-based access controls, and I was like so confused about how to take this data model we had been working on and like distill it into an interface. So Madison and I had several of these jam sessions, like multiple hours long, and just pasted the code, like the types from our code base into the Figma file, and I made some tables and we just kind of gamed it out. This was a great way for us to work. Okay, just a few more tips here. So another one is workshops and tools. So alongside running jam sessions, we've just found like working synchronously to be completely invaluable. I try my best to work synchronously like whenever I can. Workshops and like custom tools can be a really great way to facilitate this and also help to kind of codify your thinking. So what we're seeing here, we were going through this road mapping exercise, figuring out exactly what we should include in our MVP for this new Teams product. And there were just so many options. It was difficult to wade through them all and make, conscious decisions. So we ended up building this custom tool in a application called Coda that helps us collect all of our ideas and user stories and evaluate them, and it comes out the other side with basically these buckets of like what we should release for our MVP and like what's nice to have or what we shouldn't even think about building. So the point here is like just build custom tools. If you have maybe a novel problem you're trying to solve, create a workshop, drop into FigJam, just kind of play with the formats and tools you have available to you and see what can be useful. Cool. Just a couple more here. So as you're moving into more of a production-oriented design mindset, one thing that I've found helpful as a design engineer is just like building my own UI. So if you are a designer and you do know how to code, I've found it really beneficial, maybe like 80–90% of the way through your design process, before everything's fully complete and high fidelity in Figma, jump over into code and start designing and finishing all of your design work in the browser, like with code. This has been super useful for me because it's helped me identify and uncover like a lot of edge cases that I might not have noticed in more of a static tool like Figma. And it helps me just kind of like stretch my legs and learn more about the constraints that I'm working with in the code base that we have. And if you don't know how to code and you still want to start doing this, again, you can jump into code reviews and get familiar with your code base, or you can start using Figma code generation plugins. We actually have one called Figma to Code on Replit. And this can be a great way to just like get a starting point for your code, drop it into a tool like Replit or VS Code if that's what you use, and just kind of preview it and fuss around with the CSS until you feel like you have a good kind of working cadence. And then once you have this UI scaffolded out, like I built this in Storybook, so I didn't need to worry about any of our APIs or backend complexity. You can then start to work with an engineer to kind of wire up that data. Yeah, it's a really, really nice way to work. I don't know if you have anything to add here, Madison.
Nope. It's worked well for me.
Awesome. I bet you have some things to say about this one though. So this is kind of the last tip we want to leave you guys with. Ask an engineer to riff on a design. Like engineers are often very, very awesome designers who have like really crazy brains. And I just like have gotten so much value from having an engineer go off on their own and riff on some design and just come back to me with a proposal. Do you want to speak to this, Madison?
Yeah, so sometimes something will look like it makes sense when I see it in Figma. But when I'm porting it into code, I'm thinking about the user experience, or I'm finding sort of like pieces of the interaction that don't really make sense. We had this create a group modal, which is part of the team's experience. And the way that it was laid out had some incompatibilities with the API, and it was also kind of a weird user experience. So one option is to kind of drop your keyboard, go back to Devin and say, Devin, this doesn't work, help. The other option is to try to come up with something that does work or that feels better, and bring it back to design. It's usually easier to explain what's not working or what doesn't feel right if you have an alternative for what might work. It saves a lot of time, and the designer might have some feedback on your padding or your like transitions, or it might just work and you might ship it together.
Awesome. Well, that's about it. That is from Handoffs to Holding Hands. So just a bunch of tips here for how to create a culture that's really conducive to strong engineering and design collaboration. And then when you're actually in the thick of it, just a few tips for how you can sort of integrate and blur the lines between your design and engineering functions. Happy to take some Q&A.
Thanks for sharing, Devin and Madison. I'm going to go ahead and run through the Q&A a little bit. The first question that I saw here that I think would be pretty interesting, you kind of just went through this, but it would be great to get like a bit of a recap. What does having a single design engineering team look like in practice?
Madison, see you on mute.
So we have a team of design, a function of designers and a function of product engineers. And we sort of get paired together to match an initiative that the company is working on. These are usually long. So the team has been working together for probably 5 months at this point. The milestones that we have are much shorter than that. So we're usually shipping projects on the order of like 6 to 8 weeks. The faster that we can get something in front of customers, the better, to understand if it works for them. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us to kind of go underground, come up with this like grand scheme for 6 months and then put it in front of users. So we race to the finish line in those 6 to 8 weeks, and then we are paired together for a while, just iterating, coming up with different solutions. We have weekly syncs for the whole team, so design, engineering, product, who we haven't talked to, but who are also unsung heroes in this process. And we just talk about what's in progress, what's up next, what's working, what's not working. And that's how it works.
Yeah, and a little bit more concretely from like an org design perspective, our designer and our engineering teams technically, like within our org chart, are separate, right? And that's good because like they are separate skill sets, they are separate functions, their career growth looks a little bit different. So like you don't want an engineering manager like doing your career review as a designer, and likewise, you probably don't want a design manager reviewing your code as an engineer. So we look for as many touch points as possible where we can all come together and collaborate synchronously, kind of what Madison said.
And then one other question that kind of combines a few of the things that people are asking about is, how did you approach the challenge of advocating for that kind of collaboration between design and engineering, especially when folks have had tougher experiences in the past, may have had challenges, etc. Like what were some of the techniques that you were able to use to get that buy-in on both ends?
That's a great question. I want to come back to this slide on psychological safety. For Madison may have more to say here, but for me, this is kind of the biggest part of it. It's just like having open emotional conversations. Like if you feel like you've been burned as a designer, maybe you feel like you've been gatekept from something on your engineering team, just like be open about it. Say like, hey guys, I feel like I've been gatekept. Like what's going on? How can I better contribute? Is there something I've maybe done wrong? Just like having open conversations about the desire to have better collaboration can be great. Just creating that space for everybody to feel like they, are able to bring in their perspective. Yeah, that seems like probably a maybe difficult to implement tip, or maybe like too simple, but really it does come down to just like having a lot of active conversations. I don't know if you have anything to add, Madison.
I think I've been very lucky in my career in this regard, in that design and engineering have always been pretty close collaborators. Obviously, sometimes there's tension and things aren't working exactly. I think if you're in a situation where it's not working, instead of maybe trying to like fix this at the tail end of a project, I mean, if you do retros, maybe bring it up in a retro, but I would say try to get ahead of the next project. And if you're in design, pull engineering partners in early. If you're in engineering, involve yourself early, just to be part of the conversation, and try to model the behavior that you want in a team relationship. And if that's not working, yeah, I don't know, try harder.
But yeah, it definitely sounds like communication is a really big part of this. And that actually makes a pretty good transition to Julius and Daniel, who are going to be talking about what this looks like at Linear. And we'll have some room for Q&A with them at the end. And then if with the remaining time, we'll continue following up on this Q&A.
Dan, you want to start intro and then I can take over after?
Yep.
Yeah, what's up, everybody? I'm Daniel, a product designer at Linear. I've been here for almost a year, based in Colorado, near Denver.
Yeah, my name is Julius. I'm a designer turned engineer. My job title technically is an engineer. I interviewed as an engineer, but I still do quite a bit of design, as that was most of my career. I'm based in Dallas, and like Daniel, I've been at Linear for less than a year. Today, our talk title is called Vibe and Prototype. I really liked how the two talks juxtapose. Replit gave like a really great overview of like a bunch of different ways to think about like design dev collaboration. We're gonna do more of a deep dive on a specific project that we're actually working on right now. to talk through some of the things that you've already heard in the Replit slides, but we'll kind of double down on and share our own thoughts. So for context, if you don't know, Linear is a product planning tool. A lot of software dev teams use it. We've been adding a lot of functionality recently to planning features to help product manager type people come in and use Linear instead of jumping between Linear and Notion or whatever. And one of the services we have is a timeline. It's kind of like our Gantt chart feature. It's the most complex feature in Linear, Surface, single interface surface in Linear. There's just a lot of constraints when you're adding more features to kind of a spatial interface. So for example, end of last year, we redesigned timeline to have these little diamonds to represent milestones. And the thing we're going to talk to you today is our current project called Project Dependencies, where we're visualizing, this project blocks this project, and maybe you want to connect like a line between them. Also, I'm holding my dog Peach, so say hi. He's being annoying, so I had to pick him up. So Daniel, you wanna start off?
Yeah. So with like when we first started project, we like go super wide, and like Julius said, like this project kind of dovetailed from the Milestones project. So we had done like a pretty big overhaul to the whole timeline surface, and redone a lot of things. But regardless, we're adding something new to a fairly complex surface. So there may be some things that we have to like rethink, and like we don't want to be afraid to do that. So we would just go kind of super wide with different styles of lines between projects representing dependencies. We did kind of the subway style, subway map style. We did these kind of like dotted, kind of almost kind of like ferry, like if you see like a map of like where a ferry goes on like through the ocean, it kind of looks like that. And then other ones we even kind of looked at like changing the thickness of the bars and representing the bars for the project start and end dates differently. So usually what I'll do is just do a bunch of these crazy ideas and just not really worry about how neat it is, because most of the time I'm just using CleanShot to take a screenshot of like using Shift Command. I believe it's Shift Command C. It's like I just have muscle memory. I can't remember the shortcut, but I basically just copy PNG, paste it into Slack, share it with Julius, and just be like, "What do you think of this?" And I'll do that with a ton of different designs, and then we'll kind of zero in on something to prototype from there.
Yeah, that's a great segue. My MO is really to prototype stuff as soon as we can. To me, Figma is a great space for exploring a lot of rapid exploration of ideas early on, especially visual ideas. But a lot of times you just got to get stuff in with real database as soon as you can. So, for example, one of the ideas that Daniel showed in the previous slide, the kind of subway map style, we saw that and we're like, oh, that's super easy to build, at least front end wise. So I quickly whipped up the prototype. You're seeing live today. So this is actually a video recording from production from a couple weeks ago. So this is technically live, but it's behind a feature flag. We use feature flags for tons of stuff. There's tons of stuff that we're currently working on that will probably be feature flagged for like months sometimes, where we're kind of living with it and see how it feels. So in this particular example, like we really just drew like an SVG path between bars, and you can see me like recording, like testing different edge cases. What happens if I drag something here? What happens if I drag something here? You'll see some bugs, you see some glitches, but that's like part of the process, right? Like at the same time that Daniel is continuing to explore more designs around this feature, I'm also at the same time kind of forging ahead and making something that we can play with in our hands. And specifically to engineers, like it's good to develop a sense of design, to develop your own taste, right, as you're working with designers, because oftentimes it can be faster for you to kind of take your best shot at something. Like when Daniel passed me this design, like he didn't like hand it off to me in the traditional sense. There were no red lines. There was no spec written. He literally just screenshotted me something in Slack, and I was like, okay, cool. Like I can infer the rest. There's a lot of edge cases here that are not resolved. There's a lot of things that we still have to figure out. But this is kind of the value of prototyping, is that you can see that stuff much faster, and you can just send it back to the designer, and then we can like talk about it live together.
Yeah, so I mean, like Julia said, it's just like going basically like from screenshot to prototype. And you can see here all of these crazy edge cases that you kind of uncover when you're living with the prototype for a little while. That if you would have spent, sometimes redlining and speccing things out can take quite a bit of time. And it's really a waste of time, of everyone's time, if if you're speccing things out that don't reflect reality. So like all of these I would have missed, you know, so like when you know the curve intersects with a label, when you have a particular display option inside of the timeline, um, there's all sorts of little things that kind of come up. So that's really where the prototype ends up saving you a ton of time, because then you're aware of all this stuff, and afterwards you can kind of alter your design to prevent them entirely, or specify and spec out things for the edge cases.
Yeah. So sometimes that back and forth that we just showed in a previous slide, you know, is done via Slack or Huddle, but sometimes that's not fast enough. Sometimes we actually just need to build custom design tooling in our production code base. So for example, this is a video recording of something I built last Thursday called the tweaks toolbar. There's a bunch of these properties at the bottom that I added so that you can just live tweak these dependency graph lines between all the nodes. And this is something that we already have a dev toolbar at the bottom of Linear. This is something I just added onto it. And I'm actually going to show you a live demo right now. If I can figure out how to screen share. Give me 1 second. I'm going to take over Akbar and desktop 1. Yeah. So let me just move to Zoom bar. So this is you know, in my local dev environment right now, just because it's faster. You can see that I've implemented one of the ideas that Daniel had showed early on, where we had these kind of lines intersecting vertically with these bars. This looks okay, but as you can see, you know, once you start playing with different display options, it can start to look kind of crazy, right? For example, Daniel mentioned this line kind of runs into these labels. And so we started off with a bunch of properties that asked, you know, hey, like what would be like fun to play with in here? So, you know, he was like, oh, like what if we can vary like how far the line is set back from the project bar? And you can see that this doesn't really work with kind of the bend radius that we wanted, right? So for example, like if you see how in the middle above project dependencies, like if I want to offset it enough above the label, like the radius, turn radius here will just like kind of prevent that from happening. And then so like, okay, like what if we like vary the bend radius? But then you get to a point where they're kind of like straight lines, and then you get into kind of like a lot of these awkward situations where you're playing with live data and you can see, oh, like here it doesn't work really well, right? So this is just an specific example of something that we actually went through last Thursday on a design review. But this is also a place where not only you can find edge cases, but you can also like come up with new ideas. So for example, like, you know, one of the things Daniel wanted to play with was this kind of like dashed line idea. And we basically baked that into these tweaks. And so you can play with a lot of stuff. We showed this to our teammates and they're kind of like, oh, what if you could like animate it? And I was like, okay, what if we could animate it? You know, so now I'm going to show you how the sausage is made, literally, right? You can see these things that kind of look like little sausages. And then I can change the color as well. So yeah, now you see how the sausage is made.
You can get as crazy as you want.
Yeah. Akbar, you want to share again?
Yep, give me 1 second.
Daniel?
Let me just make sure I'm following
Yep.
you.
Yeah, so with the kind of tweaks panel that Julius showed, it's really cool to be able to kind of share it with other people. So we talked about, oh well, what's going on? The slides like sideways. I'll just keep talking. Okay, there we go. We fixed it. So you can really kind of like distribute these prototypes to people and just like have people try to style them. So for example, we showed the kind of like dotted line stuff to Kari, and he was like, what if they were like little marching ants, you know, like what if we animated them? So then we did, and it becomes up like a lot cooler. And then, you know, we'll have another conversation with Nan about hey, what do you think of this kind of marching ants animation? And we'll say, oh, maybe it could be a little bit slower. It's too fast. It's distracting. So it just gives people something to react to. And it's less like critique and more of helping people helping you build, which I find much more valuable when you're moving quickly.
Yeah. And so kind of one last point I want to talk about here before we kind of start wrapping up is this idea of like getting comfortable with throwing stuff out. And this is something I think designers are pretty comfortable with. So if you're a designer, you're probably like, okay, got it. But for engineers in particular, if there's any in the room, you have to really get comfortable with throwing code out when designs don't pan out. I think this is like kind of the #1 blocker to any team that wants to adopt this kind of prototype heavy workflow, is that you, in traditional engineering, you're handed requirements and then you kind of translate them into the best, purest code you can write. But in a lot of startups and product-led growth companies, this is not the reality, right? Maybe 30 years ago in like a behemoth of a tech company, that's how you work in a waterfall process. But today it's kind of hard to work that way in a lot of smaller companies. The expectation is that you're iterating stuff, making MVPs, making B0s very, very quickly. And I think it's really important to just get comfortable with the stuff that like, hey, like, sometimes like, for example, this mock-up on the top left of the vertical terminals that I just showed you, the tweaks, like we actually looked at that last Thursday with the demo of all the animations and all the little different like designs. And we're like, actually, I don't think this direction reads well and it has too many edge cases for it to work in reality. So we're actually going to go back to these kind of two directions on the right and the bottom to explore back where the lines are coming out from the right and left sides of the bars. We're actually leaning towards this like dotted like ferry, FERY, like as in the boat line concept that you see sometimes in like city maps, because it kind of has a nice balance of like communicating what dependencies are, but also like being lightweight enough to not draw too much attention over the project bars. But yeah, anyway, the whole lesson of here is just like, it's okay if things didn't work out. Sometimes you spend like a week, sometimes you spend 2 months building something, and it's the right thing to throw it out. And as I mentioned, we're kind of gonna wrap up here. When we were first invited to this talk, we saw design to code transition as the main subject, and the word handoff obviously popped up, right? And as Devin and Madison also alluded to for Replit, like we don't really believe in the idea of handoff, and we definitely don't do it in the traditional sense. We do things very, very much like live and in sync together. We are really like going back and forth, like molding this kind of clay together that we're passing this ball back and forth is really like hot potato. And eventually we come up with something that we're both happy and the rest of the team is happy with. Daniel?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, you could imagine just in the examples that we showed, if it would all have been done in Figma and you're trying to think of every single edge case, which is not possible. It really isn't. Doesn't matter how good you are. You can't really think of every edge case. So the prototyping helps you handle those problems and tackle them much earlier rather than in the 11th hour when you're trying to ship something and then you create a really high stress situation where you have to go back and fix things, and then you'll end up like not that happy with the outcome oftentimes. So I think like this kind of continuous collaboration works just much better in the end, much lower stress.
Yeah, I like to use the word continuous. If any of you are engineers or you have teammates who are engineers, if you describe to them the concept of continuous integration, right? And think about how much that's improved engineering life by having continuous integration, CI, in their workflow, this is kind of that equivalent for product development.
Yeah, and another thing is like, prototyping on the design side purely is like another thing that I like to do. So if I'm having trouble explaining something, all of these examples, like these crazy things with like dragging the dependency lines from one place to another, and you can't, like, it's hard to type out in Slack. Like, I want the dependency line to feel like a wet noodle when I'm dragging it, or what a bungee cord, or anything like that. It's much easier to just like prototype it, save out a video, and be like, what do you think of this? So not even too far away from the screen shot process. It's just basically a screen cap instead of the prototype, and I usually make these in origami because it's good for like little micro interactions and things like that. So anything that you can do yourself and prototype yourself, then go for it.
Yeah, and for engineers, I think it's important to reframe what your job is. Like you go to engineering school or some boot camp, and you think like, again, your idea is to translate requirements into code, but that's not really your job. Like, especially a lot of these companies like us in Replit, our titles are often product engineer, not necessarily software engineer, because you're working in a product-led growth process where you're really trying to iterate something quickly so that you can share it with customers as fast as you can to get feedback. And in that world, your end deliverable is not necessarily code. It's the product. It's the customer workflow that's unblocked. And so it's important to think like code is my tool, right? Like as a formally titled engineer, code is my tool, just like as a formally titled designer, Figma or drawing is your tool. those are just the things that you're using your experts at, but the end result that you're trying to achieve is the same. And I think like reframing your work as prototyping is one way to help like kind of like lessen the burden of the transition to think about, okay, all this code that I'm writing, it's junk. It's just here to help us get to some final result.
Yeah, and then I think that the last kind of little thing that kind of we want to share here is that working in this way is just like really really cool for relationships within the company. And when things are kind of cold and sterile and you're handing something off in the traditional sense, you don't really get to spend time with the person that you're collaborating with. So like you face a lot of like adverse a lot of adversity, right? A lot of challenges together. And I mean, that's kind of like a big reason or a big thing in like how human relationships are built. They're you face adversity together, and then you have that psychological safety that Replit was talking about, and you build great friendships over time. I mean, I've made great friends with people that I've worked on projects together over the years, and Julius is one of them. So, and then it's only even more fun to continue to build stuff together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm really glad that Madison and Devin spent a lot of time talking about psychological safety because I think that's a great way to think about it. But at the end of the day, we use the word friends, but like you don't really have to be like friends with with your
Yeah,
coworkers, right? Like they're your coworkers. It's okay to draw the line. Like it's your job, 9 to 5, whatever. But there is some semblance of like, hey, we're on the same team, like literally on the same team. We both have to spend 40 to 50 hours at this job, hopefully, of our lives every week. It's probably a good idea for everyone if we're like on good terms. But like, oftentimes you work with folks who are not necessarily like you agree with like politically or whatever. But at the end of the day, like what's practical is to think about, hey, like how do I set ourselves up so we can enjoy these 40 to 50 hours of the week? Like hopefully you joined this industry because you like the work, right? And sometimes it gets really frustrating because like, oh, I want to do my work this way and this person is getting in the way of me. You kind of start telling yourselves these stories, but I think that's kind of a unproductive way to think about it. Like you have to take a step back and think about, okay, like how can I best set myself up so that I can do my own work in a good way? Like maybe it goes beyond doing your work, it goes beyond go to traditionally like what you think about as like politicking or like politics, especially in a larger company. But I've never viewed politics as like a negative thing. To me, it's a skill set that you build, is your ability to build rapport, build trust with people. That's something we talk about a lot. Like our founders are all Finnish, and in Finnish culture, like trust is a big part of the culture. Like you kind of expect when someone says something that they're going to do it, and you hold them accountable. And that's a big part the day to day for me and Daniel as well. It's like when I say I'm going to do something or I tell them something directly, like there's a trust that we have like the best interest in our heart, and we're not necessarily like having some ulterior motives. And I think those are all things that just take time to build, right? And you have to be open-minded to this process. And it's not easy. It's not easy. Like sometimes you do have to like find a new job, right, to set yourself up in the best way. But that's not always
yeah,
productive. So I'll just say like
yeah.
just try your best, right?
Nothing
As Devin and
replaces a
Madison
good
said.
team.
Yeah, you just
Yeah.
start the conversation, right? Right. Yeah. Yeah, like thanks everyone for listening to us. We'd love to take some questions via Aqua.
We have time for a couple more questions. And I did see that there was a question about where did it go? On how design evolves based on engineering input. So what is the process that Linear goes through when a design has changed through the actual engineering process, and what's on prod is different than what's in the design? How do you handle and reconcile that difference?
It's a good question. Something like really funny that is in the design culture of Linear, that when I first joined, I thought was kind of like strange, but after a while, I realized it was like genius, is that you don't try to match the the design file to production 100%. It's like we kind of think about a lot of our designs as disposable, or just a snapshot in time. And often what we'll do is we just screenshot the real product and then design on top of it. And that sounds like crazy when you first hear it, but in practice, it works really, really well. So we don't view our design files as precious at all. And like I said, we do a lot with screenshots just in general, because it's like you screenshot production, you're working with the real thing always. And you're not trying to waste a bunch of time like keeping all of your components like in your designs up to date with production, because software is constantly changing. Um, so that's what I have to say. Julius, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that makes a lot of
Cool.
sense. Yeah.
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 There's
I think
there's
there's this idea of preciousness of designs that I'm really glad you spoke to that. Yeah.
mhm. There's an excellent follow-up that almost that fits that tone pretty neatly. Is like, how do you set that expectation when you're collaborating with engineers? Like if an engineer is not familiar with that process, or getting them into the process of notifying when some UI has been changed, or when some UI has
Yeah.
been completed.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with kind of like a design engineering team at Linear is just kind of like a dyad. You know, most of the time it's just two people. So for the most part, you're communicating, and as long as you keep that line of communication open in Slack and just say, hey, you know, here's a screenshot, updated screenshot. I changed this in the design, and that's you just keep the constant flow of communication going, and it never really becomes a problem. And for engineers, I think it's like you're screenshotting what's in production, so that's like the best source of truth that there is for the most part.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think it's a hard question to answer, right? Because a lot of the times it's really dependent on the company culture, right? And as
yeah,
individual designers or engineers, it's really hard for you to change that. If you're watching this talk and you're kind of like, oh, like I want to adopt some of these practices, like I'll be honest, like it's not easy to adopt. Like a lot of this stuff came with the company for me. Like I joined the company, it was already the way it worked from day one. The co-founders are kind of like a one designer, two engineers, and they kind of had this idea of like a trusting culture from day one, and it's always been remote. It's always been a culture where we
mhm,
work async and we trust what everyone is saying, and we use Slack not very noisily. We use Linear when need be. Actually, we don't even use Linear as much as like I think like some customers might imagine we would. Like for example, if Daniel has like some little bug or some little issue like that he wants me to fix, he's not going to file an issue at me. He'll just DM me, and I can turn it into an issue if I'm like trying to like, track it or something. But ultimately, like we'll catch it. I'm not super worried. Like before we ship, we'll definitely like make sure we run through. We do these things called roasts. This is a company-wide practice where right before we launch anything huge, we'll just open a document and just give everyone, hey, go play with this feature. It's feature flagged, and then just like literally just roast anything about it. Like this part is not great. This part could be better. What if we did this? And then it comes back to the team, and the team kind of goes through and like decides like what's worth doing, what's not. That's also part of ingrained in the culture. So the idea that everyone cares about design and everyone cares about quality is really, really, really important to establish before you can really like do it easily.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to wrap up on. Thank you, Daniel, Julius, Madison, and Devin. Everyone's been really engaged in the stream. Everyone really wants to learn more about the processes that you're going through and how you're handling handoff. If you want to learn more, today we've published a post on our blog, The Shortcut, called The Linear Method, Opinionated Software. You can take a picture of that QR code and it'll take you straight to the article, and you can learn even more about the linear process. Not to mention, if you want to have more of these kinds of conversations, we have Config coming up. Make sure that you register at config.figma.com. Config is going to be happening in San Francisco on June 26th and 27th. I'll be there. We'll have a few of our speakers there. We'll have a lot of great content. We have a developer and AI track for the first time this year. And so I'm really excited about hearing more from Replit and Linear on the developer track. On the first day, here are some of the features that we're speaking. We have Baron Webster talking about designing for code, creating tools on hard mode, as well as Nanu talking about organizational mitosis for startups. These are a couple of guests that we're going to be having for Nan is also going to be speaking at our event next week in New York, where we're going to be talking about Linear and Replit's process for going from design to code. So make sure that you register for that as well. And I'll put a link in the chat for that. Once again, this stream is recorded. The stream is recorded, and make sure that you'll get this will be posted on YouTube afterwards, and you'll be able to see everything that's going on here, as well as answers in the chat. Folks that have asked questions from Replit was able to answer even more questions in the chat after the fact. So make sure you go ahead and check that. And we'll do our best to do any additional follow-up. Thank you all for attending. You've been an amazing audience. And I will get that link for you for the event in New York.